Hey, good to see you here. In this video, I talk to Sahil of the Indian Dream podcast, and we get into a bunch of topics, including my story about building audience first products and some other insights that you might find interesting. Sahil and Siddharth run the Indian Dream podcast, which is a podcast but also a newsletter where they put out well researched articles on a bunch of different fields. So if that's something you're interested in, the link is in the description. You can check it out, including the newsletter which this was a part of, which is audience first products and resources around that. I hope you find this video interesting and let's jump into it.
Hey everyone, today we have Abhinav Chikara with us here today. Abhinav is the founder of 10K Designers. It's a very interesting program. You guys should look it up. It's basically a 12-week UI UX design course that Abhinav started himself, and now it's running on its second iteration, I believe. And Abhinav has done a lot of other UI UX design, including for Unacademy. He was the head of design at Unacademy, and he helped them scale quite a bit as well. So we're really glad to have you here today, Abhinav, and thanks for coming. Let's just start a little bit with your journey. From what the research I've done, you were a computer science student, and during your computer science years, you kind of got into the entire UI UX field. Can you just take us a little through that journey, how you started in UI, how you started there, and then eventually got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. I sort of got into computer science engineering, in my school days. The main reason for it was I'd watched The Social Network. And I was like, out of all the things that I could possibly do, building products is like, at this point, I'm sold, right? That movie was enough for me to make that career decision. So I got into computer science. I was at Manipal University, so MIT. And while I was there, I sort of had a change in heart, which is within my first 2 years, I realized that computer science was teaching a lot of the actual theory behind stuff, but it wasn't actually making products, which is at this point, the kind of stuff we were building as part of the program was, I would look at it and I'd be like, this is not Facebook. This is not the kind of thing a real person would use. This is a library management software, or this is ASP.NET. So at this point, I was like, okay, that along with my bad GPA, and I was like, okay, I need to find out a better game that I can play that isn't computer science, that isn't placements and all of this stuff. So that is when I accidentally discovered design in general. So it's a very common story with a lot of designers I know, which is we started making stuff for fests. We started doing that, but we did it slightly different. We started a t-shirt company while in college. And we started making a lot of these customized t-shirts for batches and for classes. Eventually, doing cash on delivery and deliveries throughout the hostels became too much work. So we were like, okay, let's figure out how we can take this online. And we decided, it's just much easier to just get into freelancing and start making websites. So I sort of got into design through that, which is designing t-shirts, eventually, trying to design websites. And this sort of coincided with the time when the iPhone had just come out a few years earlier. And a lot of people in the US wanted to make their own apps. There was like a gold rush for apps, for the App Store. So a lot of my early freelance projects were making these apps for entrepreneurs. So that was sort of how I got started. Yeah.
Oh, that's quite interesting. And I believe you made a couple of apps yourself, right? Listen and a few other things. And I remember I watched one of your videos, and you mentioned that while you were creating the first app for yourself, where you were the owner, um, you learned a lot of things. You learned a lot of growth hacking and all of that stuff as well. Do you just want to tell us a bit about like your experience in trying to create your own first app?
Sure. Yeah. So by this time, I was done with college, didn't sit for placements. I was like, freelance is going to help me just ride this through. I worked at housing.com early on. I got bored of freelancing and I was like, let me work with a team now. And after that, I was like, hey, now at this point, I feel confident. I've designed so many apps, worked at housing.com. I was like, let's do our own thing at this point. So me and a couple of my friends from housing, we started this music app called Listen. And this was an app that let you It was a chat room where you could listen to music at the same time, almost like you were sitting next to each other with like a speaker in the room. So it was like synced music sessions. And we were all, so out of the 4 people on the team, 3 of us were designers. So it was a very, very design focused app. Like even when we would think about how do we get it to market, I feel overemphasizing on design rather than distribution. That was one of the main learnings.
What does that mean though? What does design heavy mean?
Yeah. So for us, one of the things that convinced us to actually pursue this full time was we made a prototype during this hackathon, and it was you could listen to music with one person. So there was these 2 phones, separate rooms, and you were listening to music, and we were blown away by the experience. And we were like, okay, let's go full time on this. And even when we were building the beta, getting our initial couple users, we were like, we just cannot go wrong with an experience like this. We were like, compared to, like, we were deeply entrenched in the whole app game. We were like, this is unlike anything ever seen. Like this was um, before social presence apps like House Party were really on the scene. So this was, in fact, it was a perfect app for today's COVID situation, because it really, like, some of our users, for example, eventually we realized were long distance couples using it to keep in touch, right? So those are the kind of use cases. But what I mean by overemphasized on design is we didn't really think too much about distribution early on. So we were like, we're going to launch it, and it's so amazing, it's going to do well. And somehow that is what ended up happening, but it didn't sustain us too long, which is we were about 5 to 6 months in beta. That's when we launched. And within a couple of weeks, we were on TechCrunch. And back then, for an Indian app to be on TechCrunch, we were bombarded by VC messages from VCs, like, raise this, why don't you raise money, do this? And not just from Indian VCs, but a lot of investors in SoundCloud, investors in social apps in the US. And this really helped validate some of what we were doing. But we were lacking in how do you take a consumer app? Like this was the Facebook moment for me, where I was like, okay, we built something which has a couple thousand users, but to actually take it to 1 million, speaking to investors very quickly, they told us, hey, don't even talk to us till you're at 100K. Like, good to make the good to make the introduction, but for a consumer app, you need to be at least at 100K. So at that point, we realized, hey, our design chops aren't enough. We need to now get it into a more analytical mindset. So that's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So what were those, like, what exactly did you guys try to do to then try to maybe growth hack, that's a very popular word, to your way to maybe 100K? You were at 1K, and how did you try to get your way to the 100K mark?
Yeah. So with Listen, most of our users were in North America and South America. So no Indian users, mostly because Spotify wasn't here yet. And you needed Spotify Premium to use this. So in some sense, we were disconnected from I would say we weren't in LA, neither were we in Lucknow. So we were sort of in between. We couldn't build hardcore for Indian users, but we also couldn't build for hardcore the SF users.
Yeah.
So eventually we were able to scale it up to 10K. For 10K users, a couple 100K songs streamed on the platform. But the biggest problem was that we were in 2 very competitive spaces. One was music streaming, which is sort of a closed ecosystem with, in general, a lot of restrictions on how you can use APIs, as well as consumer social, which is a very trend driven space. So our limitation to growth was that a music social app has these barriers which are put in place by the ecosystems themselves. So for us, it was either pivot to something totally different, which is in music, a lot of the companies that were doing well were typically enterprise companies, which is help labels and managers find data around upcoming artists. And that was away from consumer, and we decided, that's not something we want to do. So that's when that's when the band broke up, and that's when I accidentally stumbled into Unacademy and ended up working there. Yeah.
Fair enough. So while you were working at Unacademy, you uploaded that first video that you called "Learn Design with Me" on in October of 2018. What was the plan when you uploaded that video, because I watched it and you were saying that like, okay, I want to create 10K new designers in India because UI UX is
Yeah.
such an important field. But did you eventually want to find a way to monetize it, or was it just for the pure passion of it that you made it?
Yeah. The way I started it was actually while we were designing at Unacademy. So by this time, my team was about 4 or 5 people. Um, One of the things with Unacademy is that a lot of our educators, some of our star educators, like the power educators on the platform, had their own distribution channels on YouTube. So a lot of them were using Unacademy and Unacademy Plus to monetize their YouTube channel. And sometimes it was the other way around, which is they would sign up as an educator on Unacademy, get a lot of popularity, and then they would start building out their own distribution channels. So for me, being in the position where my team was designing all the products at Unacademy, which is educator side, how do they manage all of this? The learner side, how does the learning journey look? I wanted to start my YouTube channel just to get a little bit of that kind of insight, which is what's it like to be an educator on YouTube. So very early on, that was my only motivation. I was like, okay, I know design, let me start teaching this. But then as it started getting traction, I knew that there was something here, but then I was very hesitant to jump all in and say, uh, let's do a UI UX design course. I was just like, okay, let's just do YouTube. Let's keep this passive. And Unacademy was my main focus for 2.5 years in total. Yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, I saw that on YouTube and Instagram. Eventually, you hit the 10K followers mark around the same time. That
Yeah.
was a nice little post in Cappadocia. Um, but what were the lessons that you learned in like trying to grow that YouTube and Instagram those accounts? Because it is a very saturated space overall. Like being an influencer is
Yeah.
not an easy job. Um, how did you navigate all of that? How did you get those followers? What do you think that you brought to the plate that maybe other people were not getting?
Yeah. I think with the whole influencers game, a couple of things that I've realized are that number one, most um, companies today, at some level, the founders need to be creators, which is there's a few companies I've invested in a lot. There's one which is Avalon Meta, and they've scaled up with this entire thesis, which is each of the founders is an individual influencer, and then they use that to scale their own startup. When Unacademy first started, the founders were educators on YouTube. They were super heavy on Quora. That was one of their main channels. And eventually they scaled that up to the entire system. So in some sense, I do believe that there's massive value for founders to be creators, or first time founders for them to be creators as a um, prototype into eventually starting up. But besides that, what I found really worked is also having that kind of personality online, which is if I look at design, what does best on YouTube is tutorials. So if I really want to go the numbers route, tutorials is all I should have focused on. But back then it was super rare to see a designer who's actually showing their face, who is not just doing screencasts and saying, this is what Figma's recent update, these are the new features in here. So I feel like we're at the space where people want to see more personalities. People with influencers in general, the biggest influencers today are not really specific to a niche. Personally, I feel it's a very generic space, but we are seeing the rise of influencers in very particular niches, which is there are a lot of developers today who are influencers in the dev field now. There's a lot of marketers today who are in the marketing field. So in that sense, I saw the space in the design field, and that's what I sort of went on.
You said something really interesting about how founders need to be creators as well, and that's something
Yeah.
that Siddharth and I were also discussing about. Founding influencers per se, like how a lot of brands can, if they don't have a founding influencer within their team already, they should get a founding influencer because that person has their ears to the ground. They know what people want. They can get feedback. And they can distribute immediately. You already have a
Yes.
connect with people. Um, is that something similar that you found as well? Is that like when you had your ear to the ground, you knew what people wanted, and then you were able to distribute your product much easier when you finally did think about creating it.
Definitely. So with listen, my biggest, I mean, one of my learnings was that we actually roughly waited for the product to be out to start building up that community. And since it was music, which is a very generic space, we weren't able to build super strong distribution channels. So it was mostly relying on word of mouth. And we didn't really have a strong online presence, like for our users. In the startup space, we would put out a lot of Medium articles, thought pieces, and things like that. But when it came to our real users, we had no connection with them. So what I tried to do different this time around was I knew I might eventually get into the design space. I didn't know what the product was going to be till just earlier this year. So I was like, let me passively build this audience. And the advantage that also gave me was this was a very, very slow process of research, which is through, initially I had WhatsApp group, I had a Facebook group, then Telegram, and now a Discord. This was passive conversations about over 2 years, which helped me really refine some of the things I wanted to do. And I think this content creator founder connection is also super interesting because as a founder, when you create your company, when you put your products out there, it's a much longer life cycle versus with creating content. You put out something today, you see the response to that, you see the feedback, and then you can make your next video in a couple of days. So that really gets you in this mind space of listening to users, listening to their feedback, and then trying out what works.
Iterating constantly, like you would in a company as well, right? It's really funny. You're literally narrating exactly the same thing that we wrote in an article about how you spend a couple of years building your audience and then think about making okay. But you also said something very interesting about how you constantly got feedback, how and you iterated. But how did you engage? How did like engagement on Instagram, on YouTube? It's not necessarily easy. Uh,
Yeah.
when you ask for feedback, especially in India, also is that you tend to get very generic feedback on like, hey, what you're doing is cool. How did you engage your community? How did you get them to talk to you more, etc., etc.?
Yeah. So top of the funnel for me was YouTube, and then I did run a lot of ads on Instagram. So this was when I first started the YouTube account, just to kickstart it and not just be at 0 subscribers. So I did Instagram ads, built up a little bit of Instagram, and that really helped me figure out the early days of YouTube as well. But beyond that, I created initially a WhatsApp group and then a Facebook group and then Telegram group. So Telegram was sort of the main one for me. And every single video, my call to action would be join the group to ask questions. So I knew that the audience on YouTube is a very fickle audience. They see you here, and then even if they subscribe, the YouTube algorithm might never show your video to them again.
True.
So, and I've sort of been super into this make money online space, which is passively, I've been reading a lot of this stuff ever since I was in college. And I've been hearing this advice of building an email list. Like that's something that most internet marketers.
You wrote a book called Pyjama Profits as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
About making money in your pajamas. Yeah.
Yes. So email list building has been the bedrock of internet marketing forever. But personally, I didn't really find that working for India. So I was like, let me do WhatsApp or Telegram instead. So my Telegram group became this place where people watched the video, they had a question that they wanted to ask. So they would come there. It would be either me answering the questions or the other people who had been in this community for a little longer. So that way, the community just became a place for you to get feedback. So it was almost like now when people would ask me questions, I either already had a video about it, so I would link it to them. Or if a question was coming up frequently, I was like, okay, this is another video that I need to make. So that's how I was able to get that feedback. And then eventually, there was more feedback taking once I decided to monetize, which was much harder. I can talk about that as well.
Yeah.
But those were like the early days of the community.
Yeah. No, we should definitely get to that. But I think this early foundational step is also very important to discuss because I think a lot of people are like, how do I even start? I feel like I'm past this
Yeah.
entire the social media rise.
Mm.
But you started only in 2018, and then you already built a good foundation, and now you've built your product as well. Um, okay, I think let's skip the platform risk part, because I think you have discussed it. You were on multiple platforms. You were on Telegram, you were on YouTube, you were on Instagram, and therefore you were never at risk of getting banned in one place or whatever. And
Yeah.
and you did that very consciously, it sounds like. But
Mm.
what tips do you have for somebody who maybe right now wants to grow their audience?
Got it. So I would say if your audience is um, global, the best way to do that would be an email list. Even today, um, we see most bloggers today have been replaced by Substacks, where a lot of people are writing on Substack, and this is a way for you to, in some sense, own your audience, because you're not left to the mercy of the social media algorithms. However, for India, I never found email to be a good channel for whatever reason. Um, so let's it was always like let's try instant messaging. So it was Telegram, and for me, it's Discord. But in general, my advice would be try to figure out how you can own this audience. For global, I would say email probably still works best. For an Indian audience, WhatsApp, Telegram, Discord, you might want to experiment with groups like this, private, smaller communities.
Small question about your Telegram, actually. I wanted to move on, but I have a small question.
Yeah.
One issue with community is that if there's not enough engagement, like there's not enough
Mhm.
chatter going on, it kind of dies out and people kind of like lose interest. How did you deal with that? Is that an issue you had, and did you deal with it specifically?
Yeah. So the way I did this was some of my very early attempts at starting communities, like while I was in college, nothing notable, just like trying stuff out. I realized that a lot of communities that I was a part of as well didn't were missing this one equation, which was the founders of that community as content creators. Most people that started communities started in a very decentralized way. They were like, I've created this and now let it flow. But in some sense, the founders of a community need to be the biggest content creators of that community, because now you have some shared space that the members can bond over, that they can talk about. So for me, it was putting out almost a weekly video. So at the very least, there was that event happening. And even now that I've transitioned from Telegram to Discord, so my Discord is about 1,000 something members right now. So I now have weekly events happening. So one weekly event is a Thursday live stream that I do on one of my channels on YouTube called whiteboard.fm. So that's like a Thursday 9 p.m. show that I do. And then we've also started doing these private events, which is almost like these workshops, which happen once every week just for the Discord members. So I think creating events um, is the way I figured that out.
I'm just imagining you doing like a Moulin Rouge kind of show for your Discord members.
Yeah.
Uh, so Abhinav, so you built your community, you built your Discord, you built your Telegram. At what point, and I know that point was earlier this year, but why did you start thinking about now branching out and making a product? I'm assuming you quit an academy for that as well. What was that thought
Yeah.
process that brought you finally to the product part of it?
So I wasn't sure about what exactly the product would be. But while I was at Unacademy, another thing I started other than the YouTube was this website called uisources.com. And this is a website where I collect mobile design screenshots and like screen recording. So it's almost like a repository of mobile design. You want to go find gamification, you go to that category and you find a couple designs there. So when I quit Unacademy, I was like, okay, this might be the main product. So I might monetize this, make it a subscription service, and a lot of this content gets paywalled. And then for me, I was thinking the YouTube might just be top of the funnel for this software product, which is UI sources. And I didn't really want the responsibility of teaching people design as a paid course. So for the longest time, I was like, let's not do a paid course. Let's try to do smaller ticket sizes, but something that's way more passive. So I quit Unacademy around Jan 2020. I paywalled UI sources, launched that in about think end of March. Um, and UI sources by at this point was making a little bit of ad revenue. So 50 to 100, like about $100 a month through random ad um, networks.
Yeah, that'll keep you
So
going in Bombay.
yeah. And so the first months that I launched UI sources, it did fairly well. So it was like a couple $1,000 that month. But then at the same time, I saw that this wasn't really going to grow. And one thing I noticed was when I launched UI sources, it made about $3,000, $4,000 that month, but not a single person from my community bought it, which was really surprising to me. At that point, I was like, what was the point of building this community, right? Most of the people that bought it were my Twitter followers, or from the product hunt launch, or the email list that I'd been building for UI sources, which is way more global. But nobody from the community bought it. And at that point, it was a awakening for me. I realized that, hey, it's been so clear in front of me the whole time, which is I want to do something else rather than actually listening to my audience and saying, what do they want? This UI sources, this product is great, but the signals are clear. People want a way to learn design with a lot of, as a community experience, way beyond what I've been teaching on YouTube. So YouTube, for example, has an entire playlist, which is how to get started in design. But despite doing that, people still needed the personalized feedback. They still needed somebody to say, hey, this is where you can improve. They needed an assignment where they could actually apply that. So that was when I realized, okay, let's jump fully into 10K designers as a learning platform, as a course. And so April was when I launched UI sources. May was when I launched the first 10K designers cohort.
So how did that go? How many people from your community took that course?
So that actually went really well. One of the reasons I made it one thing that's really different that I want to touch upon is it's in some sense, it's the opposite of Udemy, my course, which is Udemy, a course is $5 to $10. Mine's $1,000 course. Udemy is thousands of people taking this course with no feedback from the instructor. On my side is 30 people in a cohort, 30 to 40 people with very hands-on support. Udemy is something that's self-paced. Do it at your own time. My cohort is a 12-week program where you actually have to do your assignments. And it's not a pre-recorded course. It's live sessions every single week. And one of the reasons I did this was, of course, from my Unacademy experience. So Unacademy, one of the monetization experiments at Unacademy that worked was Unacademy Plus, which is what's propelled Unacademy to being a unicorn today, which is we switched from pre-recorded courses, like an open YouTube-like platform, to actual live classes. And that really boosted the retention, the accountability. So what was the question? What did we start with?
How did your first cohort go?
Yes. So the first cohort
that was also a very interesting thread that we were going down. I'll come back to it later, but yeah, please tell me how did your first cohort go?
For sure. So the first cohort, I was prepared to go full on and marketing it, which I didn't have to do. Within 2 or 3 days, I ended up getting about 300 applications, mostly from Instagram and from Twitter. I actually didn't use YouTube to promote the cohort at all. I still haven't. So I got about 300 applications. Very simple for me. So picked 30 people. That was the first cohort. The second cohort, also a couple hundred applications. So I increased the size a little bit. So the second cohort right now has about 40 people. But the difference between the first cohort and second cohort for me is I'm now preparing for scale. So this second cohort has a bunch of alumni mentors, which is people who did really well in the first cohort. It's got a bunch of industry mentors, which is these are people who I know from the industry who I've convinced to come on board. So like designers from Unacademy, Hotstar, Uber, a bunch of good product companies. So it's going really well. So the first cohort, out of those 30 people, a lot of them have started freelancing already. Some people are now working at great startups. And it's been really cool. Yeah.
Do you help with placements as well?
not in an official sense, not in the guaranteed placements kind of way.
Yeah.
But what we've done is the last month of the program, we do a capstone project, which is we get a problem statement from a real startup. You sort of do that. Whether the startup is hiring or not, it's a way to work on a real problem statement. And the whole focus of the program is how do you publish your case studies and build a personal brand for yourself as you're learning. So a lot of the students have gotten interviews through my network, which is I reached out to everybody I know saying, hey, you want to hire? Here's a list of 30 amazing people. But a lot of that was the students themselves getting inbound leads through LinkedIn, Twitter, Medium articles, and things like that.
Cool. So, one of my questions was also going to be that how do you convince people to pay for so much money for a course? But I think you've already kind of answered it, is that by personalizing it, by
Yes.
you yourself have put so much work, and you have kind of also helped with placements by reaching out to your network, which must be quite significant, especially considering you have such a
Yeah.
big community. Awesome. Now, um, just shifting gears a little bit.
Yep.
As an influencer, again, quote unquote, you kind of have a couple of options. You can either take brand deals, or you can go down the route of doing what you did, uh, making a product. Um,
Yeah.
what do you what has your experience been? I'm assuming you got some ad revenue, but not too much. But how should people who do have an audience think about this kind of dichotomy or these kind of choices, and how should they think about product development for their particular audience?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Um, Ad revenue for me was peanuts. So continues to be peanuts. It's like $20 to $30 a month. Um, and for most creators I know, like now that I've been doing this for a while, I know a bunch of influencers in non-design related fields as well. Um, so most of the brand deals that I was getting, and then a lot of these non-design influencers were getting as well, weren't really a great overlap for the product. So for me, it was mostly software companies saying, hey, you want to promote our product? We'll give you 2-3 free licenses. You can run a giveaway for this. And we pay you like $100 for this. And it's definitely passive income, but there's nothing you can do about it other than keep making content. So for me, it was very clear that, hey, like, I don't want to rely on just the distribution network. Like the distribution network needs to be a top of the funnel for something else. It's not the content itself. It's all of this audience that I have. What do I lead it to? Now I can lead it to a different company, which is through a brand deals and things like that. But then it was never a great fit. So at that point, I was like, okay, I need to make my own product. For me, I feel it was slightly easier because I've been in a startup background. I've designed products myself. But what I'm seeing with a bunch of influencers today is that content has become one of the products they are getting into. A lot of Indian influencers have, especially with COVID, started doing smaller workshops. So like a 5-day workshop on this, a 6-week workshop on that. And a lot of them are doing this solo, but there are companies today, like one of the companies I mentioned, Avalon Meta. So this is a company started by my co-author of Pyjama Profit. So he runs this today. And what they do is they work with these influencers, them being influencers themselves, and they help them monetize through these cohort type of programs. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Um, and do you feel like, I mean, this is very early days, obviously. This is only your second cohort. And also, I think you gave us the money you're earning from brand deals and ads. And it's very obvious also what you're earning from your cohorts.
Yeah.
The equation is like, there's no point in discussing that. But do you feel like this is a model that you can scale up one day and maybe either sell or, I mean, do whatever you want with later on?
Yeah. So I see it as, I mean, whether I like it or not, the space that I've put myself into is coding boot camps in some sense. Not coding boot camps, but in that area, which is um, product management, design, development boot camps. Most of these companies are venture funded at this point. So, for example, in the US, you have things like Lambda School, which is very similar to this, except that their financing is an ISA. So you pay after you get placed. A lot of Indian companies doing this as well. So I think that is a potential route to go down, which is increase the size of the cohorts, scale it up such that I'm not the only person teaching. You have a support system in place, and then probably get into other fields like marketing, product management, development. But then those are some experiments that I have planned for 2021, which is right now, this is one cohort that's working well. So for me, this cohort, so current one is called Masterclass, which is UI UX design. This is one product that to me has found product market fit. I'm now I will try to launch next year a bunch of parallel cohorts with this and see how that goes.
Um, awesome. That sounds like it would be quite interesting. You know what your plan sounds like to me? It sounds like Scott Galloway's Section 4 company. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you know of it.
I'm not familiar.
Okay, you're not familiar with it?
Yeah.
Well, basically, he had a huge Twitter, YouTube following, and then he started these cohorts, and then he eventually got mentors from previous classes to help with the whole thing, and then he started adding on courses, literally the playbook that you're describing. And I guess it's a very it makes sense. It completely makes sense. I actually don't have any more questions. This was a very really interesting discussion. Siddharth, if you have any other questions, we can add those. Otherwise, yeah, I guess I'll have one last question for you. At the end of every episode, we ask our guest, what is a piece of content that could be either video or podcast or a book that you would recommend to somebody who wants to maybe get into your industry or wants to learn more about design or just in general?
Interesting. Very interesting question. The biggest problem for me with answering something like this is I have like a huge information diet. So I consume a ton of stuff. And I think one of the things that I do is I remix them quite a bit. So I don't have an individual source that makes sense will make sense in isolation to everything else. But I would say for people who want to get into the content creation and building an audience kind of niche, there's a couple accounts on Twitter that are probably great for this. But then one thing I found is beyond inspiration, one of the best things you can do is figure out, is there a prototype you can try for yourself and use that to figure things out? Because I feel like with a lot of content out there, especially for this, it's very context dependent, which is the kind of stuff you will read from community builders in Silicon Valley is not, a lot of it isn't too relevant for India. And then from India itself, I don't know if there's enough content on creating communities. So a lot of it is experiential knowledge that you sort of have to figure out by yourself.
And okay, would you, since you have spent so much time in product development as well, anything that you'd recommend maybe on product development? Or is that a similar answer that, it's a mixed match of information?
I mean, I don't have any sources that I could recommend. Yeah.
No problem whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay. Abhinav, thanks so much for coming today. This was a really interesting conversation. And honestly, even for us who are, we're trying to make a audience ourselves, we're trying to make a community ourselves, we are content creators as well.
Yeah.
So for us as well, this was a really interesting discussion. And your entire journey has been quite fascinating, from a computer science grad to now heading a UI UX design course, and which could one day become much bigger than what it is right now. And
Yeah.
I'm really thank you for coming on today, and good luck for the future.
The article for this podcast is linked in the description below. In here, you'll find a bunch of links, a bunch of further reading with a bunch of examples as well. You can sign up for this newsletter on Substack, or you can sign up for their WhatsApp group. You've made it to the end of the video. Thanks a lot for watching, and since you have made it this far, please do drop a comment. Let me know that what parts of this conversation you found most interesting or most surprising. Drop the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.